This is the first in a series of professional development modules around the Common Core State Standards for English Language Arts and Content Literacy. The focus of this particular module are the key shifts that we need to be aware of as we move from our previous state standards to the Common Core State Standards. The development of the Common Core State Standards was initiated by the National Governors Association and Council of Chief State Schools Officers. The standards were designed with the goal that using them would result in college and career readiness for all students. The standards were based on solid research and practice evidence, and they were designed to be fewer in number, higher in expectation, and clearer for all stakeholders to understand. To have more students meeting the requirements for post-secondary success, the designers believed that there needed to be greater clarity in what is expected of students each year during their K-12 education. Typical state standards that preceded the Common Core were seen as too vague and too long to realistically inform instruction, so the Common Core was designed to be a set of standards that were fewer in number, clearer in describing outcomes, and higher in expectation. What is included is what is expected for all students. To help students achieve these standards, all practitioners must be honest about the time they require. Teaching less at a much deeper level really is the key to understanding the Common Core. The decisions surrounding how to focus the standards had to be grounded in evidence regarding what students in fact need in order to have a solid educational base that would prepare them for college and career demands. There had to be many decisions about what not to include. The focus was narrowed to what mattered most. If you look at the anchor standards, you'll probably agree that all of them are skills you would really want every student that you know and care about to leave school able to exercise. So the Common Core State Standards represent a moment in education when we start by talking about what we have to stop doing in certain areas, rather than telling educators about one more thing that they need to add to their already overbooked agendas. You can think of the standards and this shift in focus as the power of the eraser over the power of the pen. The Common Core requires three fundamental shifts in ELA literacy instruction. The first is the building of knowledge through content-rich nonfiction. The second, reading and writing and speaking all have to be grounded in evidence from text, both literary and informational. And finally, regular practice with complex text and its academic language are essential. The shifts are a high-level summary of the biggest changes signified by the adoption of the Common Core. They represent the most significant shifts for curriculum materials, instruction, student learning, and thinking about assessment. Taken all together, it's believed that they will lead to increased achievement and student outcomes. Everyone working in your school district should have a solid understanding of these shifts in order to understand where the Common Core differs from the previous set of standards. They are a great starting point for learning about and understanding what's expected. You can also test any message or effort regarding the Common Core, including instructional materials that are marketed against these touchstones from state, district, school, or classroom sources. You can ask yourself, how does this support the key ideas in these shifts? This is meant to be succinct and easy to remember, and in the course of this presentation, we will discuss each in turn. The first of these three shifts is the building of knowledge through content-rich nonfiction. The standards have followed the NAEP guidelines in establishing how much informational text students should read in school. In K-5, this means that we should have a balance in what students read of 50-50. So about half of instructional material should be stories, poetry, and drama, and the other half nonfiction. In middle school, the recommendation shifts to a 45-55 split between literary and informational texts. And by the time students are in high school, the standards call for a 30-70 split between literary texts and informational texts, where informational texts comprise the majority of their reading. When we think about the difference between learning to read and reading to learn, what's suggested here is that in grades 2 and on, students begin to focus more on complex texts in order to read to learn. At the same time, they're increasing their reading skills in order to derive understanding of these texts. There's a lot of talk in these shifts about reading aloud. And the touchstone here is that read aloud texts should be well above grade level when you're talking about K through 5 education and beyond. And the move is to have students begin reading texts that are at grade level or at their reading level independently so that they are better prepared for the rigors of college and career. So to give you a little bit more of the why here, why content-rich nonfiction. Research has shown that students are actually required to read very little informational text in elementary and middle school especially. There's a focus on narrative and on fiction, which we see our students performing better on in our assessments as well. By contrast, nonfiction or informational text makes up the vast majority of required reading in the college and workplace arenas. We know that informational text is harder for students to comprehend than narrative text, and so to support students in reading more informational text, we have to also teach them how to read differently when they transition between narrative and informational material. It's not just in the English language arts classrooms that students are confronted with text. Of course, text and so literacy plays a role in science and technology, history, social studies, in classes focused on the arts. Really throughout the student's day, they are confronted with text. We also know that background knowledge is connected to comprehension. And we often see that students struggle with informational text because they simply don't have the background knowledge to place the information in. But reading informational text is what is essential in building background knowledge. The standards demand that students work on literacy in all content areas, not as a distraction or as an addition to the study of content, but to build their understanding of the content being studied. So teaching kids the content of a science class, for instance, also includes teaching them how to read and understand the informational structure that the science content is coming to them in. This is displayed most prominently in two ways if you look at the Common Core. First, at every grade level, there are a set of standards for informational text and a set for literary standards. And Reading Standard 10 calls for students to read a wide range of informational text. It is actually a standard to read informational text. So much of what students read in English or communication classes will be literature, fiction. But English teachers should also expose their students to high-quality literary nonfiction, such as speeches and essays and literary criticism, for example. In the other content areas, teachers engage students in reading of the texts that are the sources of knowledge and communication in that field. Textbooks, trade journals, experimental results, and primary source documents, for instance. It's important that students see that text is a source of knowledge, that you are always reading about something. As they read a series of texts on a particular topic, they're building their knowledge and understanding of that content area. The better we can support them in it being able to manage that text, the better they get at reading, the more able they are to learn independently and efficiently through text. So the big takeaway here really is that we are not asking content area teachers to teach reading. What we are asking them to do, in the same way that disciplinary literacy suggests, is that we're asking them to teach students how to extract the content information specific to their area through text. So in order to teach somebody about your content, you also have to teach them how to read the text that contains it. And that may differ in different areas, but there are some methods that we can use across content that will help anybody get through complex text independently, which is always the goal. The next shift of the three in literacy concerns evidence. It's the obligation of students to pay close attention to what they are reading and to support what they say or write about it by providing evidence. Grounding reading, writing, and speaking in evidence from the text is not only applicable to informational text, but also to stories as well. The demand for evidence can be thought of as reading like a detective and writing like a reporter. A little bit more about the why of the grounding in evidence and that emphasis in the Common Core. Most college and career writing requires students to take a position or to inform others, citing evidence from the text, and not to provide a personal opinion. Across the grades and even across the content areas, students need to develop the skill of grounding their responses in evidence from the text, and not in their own personal opinions. Requiring students to use evidence can and should occur during oral discussions, with read-alouds in the youngest grades, and continue across all grades and content areas. This is a sharp departure from current practice, where the focus is commonly to relate the text to yourself, in narrative expression pieces where students share their views on various topics. Even when students are reading grade-level texts, they have too often been encouraged to write or discuss without having to use evidence from the text, or indeed to have read the text. We see this too embedded in our current curriculum, where we have students do a lot of writing and thinking and talking about a central theme of the upcoming text that they're about to read. So they're talking about text without having read text, and certainly without having any evidence from the text. Now, it's easier to talk about personal responses than to analyze what a text, especially a complex and difficult text, has to say. But students and teachers are likely to engage in this type of dialogue, especially before a text is fully analyzed, and then to feel that it was a strong part of the instruction because of the level of accountable talk. But in this case, the talk was not accountable to text. The unintended consequence of all of this is less time in the text and more time around the text, which is especially problematic, when we come to informational and complex text. Now, this doesn't mean that the message here is to banish personal response to a text. Though it's not called for in the standards, there are times when responses and personal connections are essential, but they're best done after the text is fully analyzed. At this point, students' personal responses will enhance the understanding of the text. As professionals, we know that college and workplace writing requires evidence, and that the ability to cite evidence differentiates a strong from a weak student performance on tests like the NAEP. Also, that using evidence is a major emphasis of the ELA standards. We see it in Reading Standard 1, Writing Standard 9, Speaking and Listening Standards 2, 3, and 4, and all focus on gathering, evaluating, and presenting text evidence. Being able to locate and use evidence are the hallmarks of a strong reader and writer. So that's the why behind this emphasis and shift to evidence. Examples of questions that take students outside of the text or require them to stay inside what is sometimes referred to as the four corners of the text, can be seen above. Text-dependent questions require students to pay attention to the text at hand and to draw evidence from that text. What this looks like in the classroom is that a teacher insists the classroom experiences stay deeply connected to the text on the page, and that students develop habits for making evidentiary arguments both in conversation as well as in writing in order to be assessed as far as their comprehension of that text and that content. This would end up with students having a more rich and rigorous conversation and developing writing that is dependent on a common text. This also speaks a bit to equity, where students with richer and deeper background knowledge are not necessarily at such an advantage when we talk about the learning that can be extracted from the text itself. In order to judge a text-dependent question, in order to decide whether or not a question is aligned with core, you need to think of three things. First of all, is it text-dependent? Is it aligned to one of the standards? And is it worth asking in terms of your content area and your expertise on the topic? So if we look at the examples, in literature, in ELA, we might look at Casey at the Bat, for instance. And a question that would not be text-dependent would be something like this. In Casey at the Bat, Casey strikes out. Describe a time when you failed at something. Does it rely on the text? Is it aligned to a standard? Is it worth asking? If you feel that it is worth asking because it is not aligned to any standard, since no standard requires personal connections, and it is certainly not text dependent since it can be answered by anyone, even people who haven't read the text. If you think it is worth asking, then the Common Core suggests that it is a question that is asked after the text has been fully analyzed and understood. On the same text, a text-dependent question might be something like, what makes Casey's experiences at bat humorous? Is it text-dependent? Can a student answer this only by having read the text and understood it? It is aligned to the standard for analyzing text. And it is worth asking from an ELA standpoint when we talk about tone and author's craft. When we look at the next example in Letter from a Birmingham Jail, you see the second question in the left column. In Letters from a Birmingham Jail, Dr. King discusses nonviolent protests. Discuss in writing a time when you wanted to fight against something that you felt was unfair. We could answer this without having read it, and so it is not text dependent. By contrast, on the right side, a text-dependent question might sound something like, what can you infer from King's letter about the letter he received? Again, it is confined to what we could call the four corners of the text, Letters from a Birmingham Jail. In the final example from social studies, perhaps as well, in the Gettysburg Address, a primary document, Lincoln says the nation is dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Why is equality an important value to promote? By now you probably immediately realize that you don't have to have read the Gettysburg Address, much less understood it, to write a response. As opposed to the question on the right, which asks, the Gettysburg Address mentions the year 1776. According to Lincoln's speech, again, there's where we have the dependency on text. Why is this year significant to the events described in the speech? Is it a worthy question? Teachers of this content can make their mind up about that. It certainly is text dependent, and it is aligned to the Common Core. We're going to take a minute now to look at the contrast between non-text dependent questions that require no careful reading of the text versus those that require students to read like a detective. You might, at this point, if you are viewing or listening to this PD with a group, you might want to pause the presentation, take a look at this example, and perhaps even bring in examples from your own content areas to see what your textbooks and even your curriculum are requiring of students and decide whether or not they fit the criteria for an evidence-based question. Spoiler alert, we're going to analyze the one on the screen here. This example comes from a high school biology textbook. The text itself is excellent. The problem is that students are not rewarded for the work of carefully reading that text because the prompt requires no comprehension of the excerpt. James Watson used time away from his laboratory and a set of models similar to preschool toys to help him solve the puzzle of DNA. They've given away some comprehension of the excerpt here. In an essay, discuss how play and relaxation help promote clear thinking and problem solving. If you look just at the last line of that prompt, anybody could write to it, and perhaps write well, but it does not reward a close and careful reading of the excerpt. You might want to take some time to look at your own questions that have come to you through your textbooks and your curriculum, and think about how you might want to alter those in order to have them become text-dependent, standard-aligned, and worth asking in terms of content. Take a look at this second example and see if you can critique it in terms of its quality, in terms of being an evidence-based, rigorous, and standard-aligned question. Again, a spoiler alert. So as we look at this, first we see that students are asked to identify methods included in the text. Is that text-dependent? Well, yes. However, it's a pretty low-level text-dependent question because very little analysis is required. The most energy in this cognitive energy in this to respond to this prompt begins with students devising their own charms and writing about that. So could a student respond without reading the text? Yes. In contrast, consider this prompt in your response to The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. A student who is able to answer this certainly has a grasp of the text and Twain's subtle use of syntax and nuance to create effects. To evaluate a question, to see if it's Common Core aligned, you need to think of whether students have to read the text in order to accurately respond versus drawing on background knowledge or offering an unsupported opinion or connection. If you want to learn more about how to evaluate and write text-dependent questions, there is a module, much like this one, on the website www.achievethecore.org, which emphasizes the use of text-dependent questions as a great first step in your classroom to start your shift to the Common Core. That website will be available at the end of this presentation. The third shift requires that all students have regular practice with grade level appropriate complex text and its academic language. And by academic language they mean the vocabulary and syntax particular to that text and that content area. Just as evidence appears all over the ELA standards, so does complex text. It is the first half of Standard 10, the same standard that calls for a range of text types. It is a standard for students to read grade-appropriate complex text at every point in school. Vocabulary is central to the standards as well. It is what Reading Standard 4 is about, and is also the focus of Language Standards 4, 5, and 6. So now we'll look at the why of this third shift. There is a gap between the complexity of college and high school texts, and it's a huge gap. Research that informed the development of the standards revealed that there is a gap in the complexity of what students read by the end of high school and what they are required to read in both college and career that amounts to a 4-year gap. In a study done by the ACT in 2006, it was found that the complexity level of what students read at each grade level has also dropped by 4 years in the last half of the 20th century, and it's remained there in the last decade. The result of this is that we are graduating too many students who can't read sufficiently, who can't read complex text specifically, well enough to survive their first year of college. Less than 50% of graduates can read sufficiently when it comes to complex texts. In response to this, the writers of the standards designed them to include a staircase of increasing text complexity from elementary through high school. So if you look at the standards, you'll see a vertical progression from K through 12 in terms of the level of complexity that students must master. Up to this point, proficiency in reading has often been defined as a student's skill in using reading strategies, even to the point of separating those strategies from the context or the content of a text. The Common Core puts the text in the center of the equation and demands that students activate strategies in service of understanding the text rather than in isolation. Mastering the strategies in isolation only takes a student so far. A successful reader possesses the ability to activate strategies in response to challenges most frequently encountered in complex text. Like every other complex set of skills, this takes lots of practice with text. Increasing complexity of text is the path to the Common Core, not increasing complicated reading strategies. So this has implications for instruction and for assessment, and that is that practicing skills in isolation from the reading and understanding of the content of a lesson is not going to get students where they need to be successful on assessments. As one person put it, good instruction is good test prep. So there's a lot of talk about complex text, but what is meant by that term? The items on this slide are descriptors of some of the features that might indicate that a text is complex. Complex texts contain any and all combinations of these features. Subtle and frequent transitions, multiple or subtle themes and purposes, density of information in terms of how it's packed into the text, unfamiliar settings, topics, or events for which students don't have background knowledge, lack of repetition so that a main idea is not hammered home, or the overlap or similarity in words and sentences are often not repeated as well, and we all know that that helps students comprehend when there is repetition. Complex sentences that need to be navigated through, uncommon vocabulary, a lack of words, sentences, or paragraphs that review or pull things together for the student. A colleague of mine once called this inconsiderate text, where the text doesn't guide the reader, doesn't stop to sum things up, doesn't allow for any reflection. Also, longer paragraphs, and any text structure which is less narrative and or mixes structures. So these are the types of things that we look for when we identify a text as complex. The complexity level is determined by both quantitative and qualitative measures. The details of text complexity are well described in Appendix A of the standards, one of the supplemental readings offered with this module. New tools have been developed since the standards were developed to help determine qualitative text complexity. And those materials are also now available at achievethecore.org. When we take a look at the indicator uncommon vocabulary, we know that students who struggle with reading almost always have gaps in their vocabulary and their ability to deal with complex sentence structures as well. This too is documented by research. often less proficient students are given texts at their level, where they do not see these features, where the demands of vocabulary and sentence structures are lowered. Though this is done for the kindest of reasons, it has disastrous consequences. Day by day, differentiating by level of text during instructional time increases the achievement gap between high performers and those who struggle. Students can't address gaps in their vocabulary and develop skill with unpacking complex syntax in text when they're not given the opportunity to work with that material, and they're not given the text that gives them opportunities to be taught to manage these things. With that said, there is a place for providing students with text more appropriately matched to their individual reading abilities, and in our district we use the SRI and the Lexile for that. We can do that to build fluency and to provide opportunity for increasing the volume of their reading. But those texts can't be the primary text for instruction because they will not increase the level of complexity that a student can manage independently. The standards do require that students read appropriately complex text at each grade level independently, and that's standard 10. That's not stating that they must read text at their ability or Lexile level. It's saying complex text at their grade level, and it says independently. So obviously we have a big problem here when it comes to teachers' knowledge that you can't simply put complex text in front of a student who is not ready and able to even decode it. So it all becomes about scaffolding, and it's essential that teachers and instructional materials provide scaffolding, just as it's essential that the scaffolding is then removed systematically as the student becomes more and more able to deal with higher level text. Our current curriculum does have a lot of embedded scaffolding that is in line with the recommendations from the Common Core designers, and these include multiple readings, read-alouds, and chunking of a text. We're also beginning to talk more about close reading during our multiple readings. Complex text requires multiple readings to fully understand the layers of meaning provided by an author. Because of this, we have to be very selective when we pick a piece for close reading. Close reading takes a lot of time, and you want to use that time with a piece of text that is rich enough to really help students see how you have to navigate syntax, navigate ideas in a different way during difficult parts of text. Rereading assists fluency and is the primary way that readers do make sense of challenging encounters with reading. So when we stop to examine a small piece of text for an extended period of time, we want to make sure that what students are left with is a greater ability to manage and have confidence with difficult text when they run into it independently. Reading the text aloud while students follow along, which is always a challenge, is what is meant by read-alouds. Fluency challenges are rampant when students encounter grade-level appropriate text that they aren't quite ready for. All teachers must be aware of this and reach in to help. The two best ways to help are having the students follow along while the text is read aloud. And in order to make this modeling of fluency powerful, teachers should really practice that piece ahead of time so that their own voice and reading supports understanding by having the emphasis in the right places and pausing appropriately as they read through complex sentences. And they want to read the text multiple times. These two methods are systematically built into close reading models and are a part of the revisions of our core curriculum in our district. Read aloud is essentially important for early readers in K2 because the standards are too complex to master with the text students can read on their own, and students cannot develop academic language through what they can already read. at their grade level. For all practical purposes, read-alouds provide students who come to kindergarten with less developed academic language a way to catch up. When we talk about chunking, we chunk longer texts into smaller logical sections to make the text more manageable and help demonstrate how the author has structured the text. So a well thought through chunking of text would pay attention to where there are shifts in meaning, where there are shifts in setting, where there are shifts in a narrative, where something difficult is happening. You want to chunk right after that occurs. Careful text-specific questions are also important to point readers to the challenging sentences and ask for a special attention to be paid to them. So when a teacher is preparing questions, evidence-based questions, they want to focus those questions on the parts of the text where something important is happening or something difficult, some difficult syntax, some difficult imagery is occurring. These direct students to what matters most in the text and ask them to examine those parts. We should also pay particularly close attention to vocabulary that can be figured out in the context of the text. Some can't, because this requires text evidence as well and demands rereading. Pointing out text structures and features that will either provide comprehension support, like pointing out section headers, or challenges like long paragraphs or sentences, is also what we do while reading and show students how to use those landmarks to better navigate text. Supports that do not promote improved reading outcomes and do not have research support behind them include previewing the topic of the reading in a text-free way, just talking about the subject of the upcoming read, does not have research behind it when it comes to improving students' reading. A careful examination of the text is solid practice, but telling students what they will be reading removes motivation for discovering that for themselves, and it teaches students that learning from reading is not the central activity in that classroom. It's learning from the teacher. So one catchphrase that resonates is the text is the expert. Another thing that is not recommended is providing simple text to weak readers and complex text to strong readers. Differentiation by text type as opposed to providing a variety of supports for the same complex text leads to what we call the Matthew effect. To those who have, more will be given. To those who have little, even that little will be taken away. A well-researched finding. This is particularly true because of the differences in vocabulary that students will see from simpler to more complex texts. Words create much of the difference in texts. The goal is growing independence with increasingly complex text. The strategies implemented should all aim at getting students stronger and more skilled, like exercises and scrimmages in a sports practice. One final thought that's important to keep in mind before we move on to the core strategy for providing support is that just because a student can't read a text does not mean that they lack the ability to think deeply about and discuss a text. When we give students different texts, we shortcut this possibility of having them participate in the unpacking of concepts and comprehension of a complex text. So let's not confuse low reading ability with low cognitive ability. In our district, we've already started to talk about close reading, close analytic reading, not to be confused with close with a Z reading. This practice, if a teacher strives to do one thing differently in their classroom, this would probably be the one that would get the most result and get you closest to the shifts to the Common Core. A close reading hones in on the difficult portions of text and provides students an opportunity to work with those sections, as opposed to a think aloud, where teachers explain these difficult portions before students have had a chance to learn from them on their own. Not only is virtually every standard evident, the 3 shifts required by the standards are evident as well when we enact close reading in our classrooms. There's a sequence to preparing a close reading activity in a classroom, and the first step in that is to find the text that deserves to be examined with a microscope. It should contain the core learnings of whatever the lesson is, as well as be difficult and need some explicit instruction about how to navigate through it. After you've located a text that seems to be ripe for close reading, you have to then create text-based questions like the ones discussed and examined earlier, and in order to focus students during a close reading so that they extract what it is you have determined is important about that text. Close reading requires prompting students with questions. So those questions are being worked on in our common core in our curriculum revisions, but teachers also should become skilled at creating this type of question. Again, this is not a think aloud where the teacher provides an interpretation or talks through the difficulty. It is an activity where the questions do the work of focusing students into the text in a deep way so that they learn to navigate through it, unpack complex sentences, dig for meaning, dig for images, dig for repetition, whatever it is that the teacher has found worth teaching in that chunk of text. Close reading can be done with fiction, nonfiction, poetry, but because it does take quite a bit of time to do well, you should try to keep it to a short chunk or excerpt of a larger text. So here, as promised, is the website where you can find a tremendous amount of information and resources and tools. This is achievethecore.org, the website of Student Achievement Partners. They are highly reliable. Everything on here has been vetted as aligning to the Common Core, and it is free. Steal these tools is what they're telling us. Free resources, especially useful for implementing this year. Things that you can read, articles, research, and also some work by teachers for teachers. And these are things that you can lift, adapt, and use in your own classroom, again, if they are aligned well to what you are doing in your curriculum. So please feel free to visit. I stole this entire presentation from achievethecore.org. And you can also move on in these professional development modules at your own pace because they are all here as well.